Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Now, this second session, after the tea break, we have about 4 presentations to make. The first one being harnessing the demographic dividend through the investment in youth. Problems with the youths. And every country has this problem about the youths. In 1996, war broke out in Sierra Leone, which lasted about 10 years. And after the war, we had a problem about how to address the issues of the youths. Government created several institutions to address them, the youths. That's why you see in our country, even the other political parties, they skillfully avoid using the word youth. Because during war times, the word youth connotes several things. To some people, when you say youth, it means violence. Because the youths have a lot of energy. So what we're trying to do now, how do we harness, how do we convert this energy to some useful energy that will be productive for the development of the country? This is where we have the problem now, the challenges. How do we put together a framework to address the issues confronting the youths in our various countries? So we will see in our presentations what kind of investments, what kind of structures, what kind of things that we need to put in place, what kind of legislations that we need to put in place. How do we address the issue about the youths, issues about civil society organizations? How do we address these issues? These are the issues that we have to address this afternoon to see how we can share our experiences from our various countries so that we can advise our speakers, our legislators, and most probably the executive to see what interventions that we can put in place to address this issue of youths. You see, in my country, 2 of the political parties tried to avoid using the word youth. The others skillfully say young generation. They call them the young generation. The other political parties, they prefer to use the word the young pioneers, just to avoid the word youth. You see, because most probably for some of us who suffered in the hands of the youths, as soon as you call the word youth, you start to feel the trauma in you. So how do we address this issue? What kinds of intervention that we can put in place? Now we have with us the consultant who is going to address, who is going to advise us, who is going to put a framework, who is going to share her experience so that we can put together a framework to address the issue of the youth. So it is my pleasure to present Madam, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Never mind. Yes, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
And thank you very much, Honorable Vice President of the Association of Secretaries General of African parliaments. My name is Francine Muyumba, chairperson of the youth, the main structure that deals with issues relating to the African youth. So we deal with all manner of topics relating to the youth at the African Union. Let me start, Mr. Vice President, by congratulating the Pan-African Parliament and also say how grateful we are to see that in 2017 is designed to invest in the African youth. As you are no doubt aware, heads of state and government during the January summit decided to make sure that the youth of the continent are taken into account, thus demonstrating the fact that our leadership is quite conscious of the problems that bedevil the youth across this continent. Let me also submit that during the SAID conference, we were there to see how best we could take on board decisions taken by heads of state and government in January during the summit of heads of state and government held in Addis Ababa, which adopted various resolutions prepared by the youth during their meeting in Chad under the auspices of His Excellency Idris Igbo of Chad, and who is the champion of this very topic for 2017 on behalf of the African Union. So the youth met in N'Djamena, Chad, to prepare recommendations to be later submitted to the leadership of African continent, because today the African youth is going through trying times. More than 60% of the African population is made of young people. 60% of loafers in Africa are similarly part of the same group, and therefore their share of economic activity is rather limited, and therefore Africa is really not about to solve the problems that bedevils this continent. We have noticed that most African countries do not invest in the youth of our countries. There are, of course, countries that have got programs that are designed to cater for the youth, but some don't have any at all to help develop the youth of their respective countries. This has led to a plethora of problems in our countries because the youth are therefore recruited in all manner of activities to destabilize our countries and bring about the political troubles that we experience in our countries. So the African Union had decided, therefore, to ensure that this topic deals with problems that relate to the youth. Challenges are there. How do we implement all these decisions in the various member countries of the African Union? During the summit in Quito, we decided to inspire ourselves from the decisions taken by the heads of state and government and to address the problems of the youth. We came up with a roadmap, and this roadmap relates to this year's theme, together with 5 pillars. There's one pillar that is missing. It is the one that deals with peace and security. And therefore, I would like to refer to the pillar that relates to entrepreneurship and employment for the youth. Then we have another pillar which deals with education. A third one deals with health, And our fourth deals with governance and youth participation. So with these pillars, member countries were called upon and requested to look into actions that need to be brought to bear in the various countries. Therefore, it is incumbent on African parliaments to come up with a program that will be designed to sell these programs, ensuring countries are able to come up with various activities to be implemented in the said countries. The African Youth Movement and the African Union Commission have been around member countries to sensitize heads of state government on these topics, to see what concrete actions could be proposed to the youth. Because I think ourselves to just making speeches at the African Union without having concrete actions on the ground designed to help develop the youth of the continent. Furthermore, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, continue in English.
Honorable members of Parliament, a youth perspective inherits the idea of something new, rethink old concepts, and the questioning of current happenings. The African youth undoubtedly constitute more than 6% of the continent's demography. In most of the African countries, we see the youth not adequately represented in the economic, political, and social spheres, in spite of Africa being the second fastest growing continent in the world, with likelihood of prosperity in the future if the resources are well managed. Every year for the next decade, it's been estimated that over 11 million youth are expected to enter Africa's labor market, making Africa have the biggest labor force in the world because of a rising number of youth. However, the African youth hardly serves as the driving force behind future development. The African population is quite youthful and offers a huge labor force as a driving factor in realizing the dream of the African Renaissance. Thus, we cannot talk about the youth without addressing some of the major crises facing the youth in the continent. In spite of youthful innovations, the biggest task remains the management of the dividend to ensure the trickle-down effect to benefit the small-scale and medium enterprise African youth and the farthest villages in the continent. We look forward for many years in the future when African innovations and businesses will be well established and transnational companies overseas, and posterity will recall that it all started as tentative youth interaction at global arena. This is a vision far off in the future, but it is a goal toward which we will realize. When we talk about youth, we cannot forget the fact that the clandestine migration has been stated as one of the biggest crises being faced now, with thousands of youth losing their lives trying to cross over the continent looking for greener pastures. OEM reports stated that in 2016, 60,000 deaths were recorded from Africa as a result of migration. We continue losing youthful lives due to this. The issues of health security cannot be underestimated when talking about the African youth. Most households are ravaged by a vicious cycle of poverty and ill health, even though most health problems are preventable. Addressing health problems in the community will contribute to poverty alleviation and promote general well-being through capacity building. Honorable members of parliament, when you talk about education during your debate on the team, I would like you to remember the more than 130 million girls out of school in the world. In Africa, in the 130 out of school girls, we have 51 million of African girls out of school. So when we talk about education, under the pillar of education in this roadmap, let's remember these young girls who are out of school. To add on this, the topic issue of tapping in our diaspora should also be fully and vastly be invested in. For instance, in Kenya in 2015, the diaspora contributed to 5% of their GDP, and this makes the diaspora a powerful community to include national development agendas. Reports have shown that Africa has millions of diaspora living or studying abroad, and most of them are the youth. I therefore urge our government to embark on skills and talent remittances so as to bring the skills and knowledge of our brothers and sisters who are outside in order to harness the demographic dividend. Mr. Vice President, you are all aware of the 2006 adopted African Youth Charter, and it is my belief that when all African states revise their national youth policies, national youth councils, African youth problems will be reduced and not eliminated. And therefore, I urge the members of parliament here present, for those countries who haven't ratified the African Youth Charter, to do so in order to respond to the rights of the youth of their countries. Then if we don't ratify the African Youth Charter, that means that our countries does not have youth. And this is really one of the critical issues if we cannot tackle the issue of the Charter. For the past 2 years, the Pan-African Youth Union, which I lead, as you all know, it was established in 1962, before even the organization of the African Union by our forefathers, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Sekou Toures, and more others who established the Pan-African Youth Union, at that time called African Youth Movement, which was used to liberate countries from colonial forces. And then later on, when the organization of the African Union changed into the African Union, then the Pan-African Youth Union changed from the movement of the African Union, from the movement of African youth to the Pan-African Youth Union, to move from more a political a spirit of the activism for the African liberation to defend the African youth economic empowerment. And this is the organization that we lead now. And I'm seeking support from the parliament also to advocate for the empowerment of the Pan-African Youth Union, for it is very historical, and we have to make sure that our countries, to the national youth councils, we empower the Pan-African Youth Union, because we are elected by member states of the African Union, your countries as well, the national youth councils. And currently the one I'm leading, the Pan-African Youth Union, I was elected here in South Africa by African Union Council, National Youth Council. As you all know, moving from words, from speeches to actions. During the summit that has just ended, we told heads of states that we cannot meet again for speeches. So we went to the champion of the theme, His Excellency President Idris Deby know and say what we want for the coming summit. We want commitment. We want heads of state to be able to say, this is what we are going to do for the youth. This is what we are doing for the youth. This is what we have done, and this is what we are going to do. And I'm very pleased to announce that we got commitment, enough commitment from heads of states and also from member states through the adoption, unanimously adoption of the African Youth Development Fund creation. It had never happened in the issue of the Union. Youth never had a budget, really a concrete budget in the African Union in terms of youth development. And now I'm pleased to announce to you that we have a budget, a youth fund that was created by heads of states. And then not only, but we had also commitment of a budget allocated to this youth fund, which happened to be, for now, 1% of the Union budget, close to 7 million. But our target, we are looking to have at least 200 million in order to empower the young people, especially in the agricultural sector, entrepreneurship, those having brilliant ideas on entrepreneurship. We empower them, we reach them in the rural areas, and then we give them access to finance in order for us to reduce the unemployment rate that we are having on the continent, and unemployment to be the major problem of many member states on the continent. So I urge the Parliament, honorable members, to be able to mobilize together and also African members and all the partners of the African Union to invest in this fund, because the fund will also empower our youth organizations, the national youth councils, the youth volunteers, the capacity building of the youth volunteers we are having in the African Union, who are also employed in the regional organizations. And we also urge the Pan-African Parliament to also have some youth volunteers to also work this side in order to contribute to the work of the Parliament and also to promote the youth work within the Parliament. On a medium term, we are looking at 500 million, and beyond on a long term to have more than 5 million, because the decade from 2017 to 2017, 10 years to come, the African Union will champion the issue of youth to make sure that these issues are tackled. Because we could not only discuss in 1 year about the youth of the continent, knowing that this issue is really disturbing the continent in terms of the continent's peace and stability. Also glad to inform you that this year's Africa-Europe Summit will also focus on the youth. This shows how much the entire world is committed to the issue of youth development. And prior to the Africa-Europe Summit, there will be a youth summit. African youth and Europe youth will meet to discuss issues that are affecting the continent. Not only issues, economical issues and political, also the equality in terms of partnership between the Africa and also Europe. We should be able to tell what is going right and what is going wrong in terms of these two continents, to show that also Africa cannot continue to be a baby or to be given instructions, but Africa is a strong partner that also contribute to the world development. And this is the message that we want to put across. So, in conclusion, I would like to urge all the members of Parliament here to help us, together with the African Union Commission, to mobilize partners in order for us to invest in this youth fund already established by the Parliament. When we have joint efforts, we have concrete results on the ground. But when each country does things on its own, it becomes very difficult for Africa to have more concrete results when it comes to decisions that we are making. We have to translate ideas into actions, because when we speak with one voice, we move forward as a continent. I hope that there will be another conferences. For sure, we will have more time to talk again tomorrow. So we should be able also to seek support from speakers of parliament to be here tomorrow with your support, for sure, to be able to address these issues. The African youth, I'm the word, but are quite tired of the debates, and they want to see actions, because this is the message they sent me to put across. It is not my message. I'm delivering their message. And when I'm delivering the message, sometimes I must bring it the way they told me to bring it. So African youth are asking that African member states and all of you, including the parliament, we should be able, in working on a direction where we can be able to influence some of these decisions. So, Honorable Vice President, honorable members of parliament, I think I cannot exhaust most of the things that I can hear mentioned in regard to the demographic dividend, as we have more time, including tomorrow, and also the other people who might contribute to this. So this is the work that we have done with the African Union in terms of youth development, in terms of youth investment. The pillars are clear, and the pillars of the roadmap are having key actions. So we cannot invent other solutions. The solution is there, and what we have to do is just to make sure that those things are adopted. And we thank all the member states for support, and especially my country, the Republic of Congo, and also other member states who have been able to support us, Algeria, and all those who have been able, Chad, able to support us in making sure that we implement the demographic dividends. So, Mr. Vice President and Chair, I thank you for this opportunity.
I think she needs to be given a big hand. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. We would take the other presentations because all of them share a common heritage, or there is a commonality in them. One is talking about the conceptual framework, the other one is talking about the challenges, and the other one is talking about the investment, and this one is talking about all of Parliament in all of this. So we can see that the presentations are similar in nature, although a bit different in characters, in the sense that one talks about one framework and another one talks about framework. But all of these go to address the issue of the youths, the youth issue of our young men, our young pioneers. We see the future leaders, or the leaders of tomorrow. We say the youths are the leaders of tomorrow, and some are saying they are the leaders of today. We cannot postpone that to tomorrow. Why, in fact, to postpone it? It is because we want them to acquire more experience so that they can go through the different challenges that the elders have acquired during the period. So without wasting much time, we want to look at the second presentation, which has to do with the conceptual framework and the presentation. Now, what do we need to put in place? What structures do we need to put in? What framework? What do these youths really want? She has given a presentation as the goodwill ambassador for the youths. It is for us to examine this message now to see what we need to put in place. So that one will be given to us by our consultant. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I will do with a PowerPoint presentation. And my presentation will focus on the conceptual framework, a bit, and elaborate on the African Union roadmap on the theme of 2007. My presentation will basically be made in 4 parts, 4 main parts. I will discuss what is the genesis, all of this discussion or discourse come from. I will provide a background to this theme, and I will discuss the implementation and follow-up mechanism that is in place. Okay, I will not really follow the PowerPoint, and I hope colleagues from IT will assist with that. When we talk about harnessing the demographic dividends through investments in the youth, I was tempted to say that it started when the heads of states a resolution to that effect. But then when we look back, the values and virtues of African tradition that we are all part of embody this whole idea of supporting the youth, ensuring that the youth can be the center for development. And these aspirations, when we look into the major instruments, particularly human rights instruments adopted under not only the UN system, but also the AU system, and particularly I will refer to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and when it comes to Africa, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. All of these instruments, when you interpret them, you can see the extent to which they apply to the idea of harnessing or empowering youth. But then, because those are general, instruments of general application, it's important to note that a number of instruments which are specific to youth have been adopted at the UN level, where we have the UN Convention on the Right of the Child, and at the African level, where we have the African Charter on the Right and Welfare of the Child. And I think there's an intersection which applies to youth as defined by the African Youth Charter. Then the debates continued in Africa, particularly with the adoption of a number of policy documents, and particularly the NEPAD's framework on youth program in 2004, and the UN World Program on action for youth adopted in 2005, which then led to the adoption in 2006 of the African Youth Charter, and included as a part of the documents that you have or will receive. I hope you will have time to really look into those documents. But what's more important is that when the African Youth Charter was adopted in 2006, it took 3 years for it to enter into force. And when it entered into force in 2009, the AU heads of states declared a decade on youth from 2009 to 2018. It means that basically, even when this on the theme of the year 2007 was adopted in January 2017, it was basically at the conclusion of the African decade on youth. But then, what is common? The common ground amongst policy instruments and the other legal instrument that I referred to, the common ground is that on the one side, they seek to raise what are the main challenges faced by the youth, and on the other side, they seem to provide some remedial action through concerted efforts. And one of the key issues which are common to those instruments is primarily multi-dimensional approach to youth empowerment and development. So all of these instruments seek to suggest that there's no one approach to dealing with youth issues. We have to put in place multi-dimensional approaches to be able to respond to the needs of youth. Secondly, those instruments put a clear emphasis on a human rights-based approach, because advancing youth empowerment should be embedded in human rights, and particularly when it comes to Africa, we have a wide range of human rights instruments that are adopted. Thirdly, these instruments seem to also put an emphasis on ownership and capacity building. Ownership, in one word, youth should be empowered through the youth, through the youth and with the youth themselves. Basically, what it suggests is that the suggestion is against the setup where youth issues are being debated without even the youth being part of the discussion. The youth should take ownership of the processes, the discussions that related to their empowerment. Costing, budgeting, and expenditure as well is a cross-cutting issue, and particularly when you look at the African Charter on Youth, the African Youth Charter, it calls up parliaments and generally member states of the African Union to youth mainstream when budgeting and spending. Lastly, regional and global dimension is also one of the issues which is common to the extent that it's required that the situation of the youth be looked at not only in a national closet. It should be looked at from a regional and a more global perspective, and that's where debates on youth issues should be dealing, for instance, on issues having to do with migration, for instance, environment, the causes, and remedial action, for instance, for all these young people crossing the Mediterranean and risking their lives to go and seek greener pastures. I'll go to the next slide. Then the policy instruments and legal instruments that I referred to are clearly what constituted the background for the heads of states to adopt this theme of the year for 2007, particularly taking stock of the fact that we have legal instrument and policy instrument, but challenges relating to the youth empowerment continued. And it was felt that there was a need to interrogate ourselves as Africa to maybe do things differently in trying to transform education, to try and skill youth, to try and improve health facilities and many other facilities and entitlements that are relevant to the youth. And basically, the decision was evidence-based, and I don't know if it was really a coincidence. Since 2012 and 2013, more authoritative studies were conducted and revealed the fact that Africa, which is seen sometimes to be a continent which is rich in terms of natural resources, and we have so many countries which are blessed with wealth. It was found that actually the demographic progressions in Africa seem to contain what can be seen to be the best wealth, which is human capital. And I hope our colleague from UN will be able to really expand on that. And that wealth is the demographic mutations that we are undergoing, which will result in having an increased youth or working population against a reduced birth and mortality. And at the same time, there will be a decreasing dependent population. As a result, Africa, and particularly the youth of play a very important role in political, social, and economic affairs. But for that to happen, measures, targeted measures, have to be adopted, have to be taken, so that we can take full advantage of this demographic progression. The decision was taken in January 2007, and to ensure that it's fully implemented, the roadmap was adopted. And the roadmap also, again, is embedded in how policy and the strategic instruments, for instance, the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, and so forth. but also a number of legal instruments, which I will just skip because I talked about those instruments. But what's more important is the roadmap contains a number of guiding principles and values, which are, for instance, principles of transparency, democracy, good governance, anti-corruption, and the rule of law. Because youth, all these measures which will benefit youth cannot be fully implemented, effectively implemented, if there's no transparency, if there's no democracy, good governance, and other shared values common to our African member states. There's also the issue of accountability in delivering services. And I think parliaments have a role to play in terms of ensuring accountability. Women and youth participation in decision-making at all levels is also one of the guiding principles and values. A multi-sectoral approach and human rights for all also are part of it. The roadmap contains 4 pillars, and the previous speaker has alluded to those 4 pillars. I will not expand, but just to say that the first pillar is employment and entrepreneurship, where a number of actions, key actions, are defined to ensure that youth employment and entrepreneurship is taken forward. Secondly, education and skills development is seen to be key, and a number of actions are also defined, including reviewing the current educational curricula in Africa, including expanding on vocational training and establishing and strengthening regional education institutions and so forth. The third pillar is on health and well-being, where again a number of actions are defined, particularly calling upon member states to give priority to investments in the health sector, to establish and promote integrated adolescent and youth-friendly health services, and many other actions to promote and protect the health and well-being. And lastly, the fourth pillar is on human rights. The fourth pillar is on human rights and good governance, where member states are called upon to put in place normative and institutional frameworks which could facilitate the empowerment for youth. In conclusion, I just wanted to say 2 things. First of all, through this team, our leaders have reaffirmed the fact that human capital is the most important, the most valuable asset that Africa and its member states have. And I think we need to take advantage of this. And secondly, and this comes from our leaders as well, and I will read, harnessing the demographic dividend through investment in the youth has the potential to have far-reaching implications that would address all the key issues that governments have had to contend with, and change the development trajectory of Africa towards building the Africa that we want. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think we can see ourselves in different countries, the perspective that has been presented with respect to youth development, with respect to the problem of our youths in our various countries. And maybe at the end of this roadmap, that will assist in addressing the issue about our youths. Whether it is a question about illiteracy, to put in place structures that would address illiteracy, and some of the time we talk about the privileges that should be given to the youths, but hardly do we really address the responsibilities that go along with our desire to design these programs. Our youths, they'll give you all kinds of things that they want. And as soon as you put the framework for the responsibilities, they start to shy away. I mean, you should give me freedom to do whatever I want to do. Parents would say, you should not be out of the street after 10 o'clock. And they say, that's my liberty. You should not interfere with my private life. You see, and you as parents also, as a government, you owe a responsibility to model your youths so that they can be very much useful to society and not to create more problems. These are the kind of things which they are talking. We have the capital for investment. But how do we put this capital in true perspective so that this capital can be useful, to increase our productive capacity so that our country's livelihood can increase? So we have the other presentation, which will also be taken by another very important consultant, I may say. So we listen carefully again to that presentation. At the end of the presentation, we give our interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. My name is Richmond Chemoko. I'm the policy advisor on issues at UNFPA Regional Office for East and Southern Africa. It's really a pleasure being here. If you permit, I would like also to take this opportunity to really wish all the honorable women in-house and outside a happy Women's Day. Today is National Women's Day in South Africa, and as mothers, sisters, and advisors to men, I cannot start my presentation without really wishing you a happy Women's Day. On that, I would just like to build on the previous presentations and look at few issues. Mine is to talk about challenges and opportunities. And I think before we talk about it, I would like to focus on challenges. What do we mean by demographic dividend? And then program and policy challenges, as well as opportunities. I think the challenge, as well as the opportunity, is also the way we look at issues in Africa. Do we look at it as a disaster or as an opportunity? The chair just mentioned the issue of capital. I think what is critical is to change in the narrative of population issues in Africa. And it's really our role to change that narrative from the negative to a very positive one. And I put here a quote from my director, but it's something that we all can say, that population issues in Africa is an asset. And if the African member state now has to really harness demographic dividend, it's because we need to take cognizance of the fact that a youthful population is a potential for us to really contribute and fast track our development process. If we continue to use a negative narrative on population, it will not help us and may lead to further challenge. So that's the first step of the issue. The second is demographic dividend itself, to situate it in a broader context. And the broader context is starting with what our continent has. The Agenda 2063, which is our vision of what the continent wants to achieve in the next 50 years or less than 50 years. But demographic dividend is also well situated in the global framework for development, what we call the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in all this, what is critical is what honorable members you have been doing, is to put human being at the center of the development, is to put individual at the center of the development. So that's the framework I want to start with. Now, the key question is, we have been talking about the roadmap and demographic dividend. What is demographic dividend? And how do we present it to our constituencies, to our brothers and sisters, but also to the government? Demographic perspective, macro perspective, demographic dividend is a benefit, economic benefit, that is arising from a change in population structure, age structure. So it's from a very critical demographic perspective. Next slide. Yeah. So if it's the economic benefit arising from a change in population structure, then there are some preconditions to harness the demographic dividend that we want. But before going to that, the first challenge or discussion we very often have is, okay, we have countries, many countries that have high economic growth. Any major change in the population structure. So the story, what we are saying here is not that change in the economic, in population structure is the only condition to have economic growth. No. I say economic growth can even be faster, and you could have better development if you that with change in population structure. In other words, the change in population structure is a boost to economic growth. But that change can only happen if you have decline mortality, people, you have few people dying, and you have also couples, women and men having the number of children that they want. And in general, that number is what many women go through. In addition to that, you have also a need to have the working population skilled and be employed. Next one. Yep. So I would like us, before we look at, to focus a little bit on this graph, particularly the two pyramids at the bottom, at the corner there. You have the ray pyramid, like a triangle, and then you have the other one which look like a nice basket, where that I think in Burundi and Rwanda, those kind of basket with the cone. The first one is population of a particular country represented by age group. The green line in bottom represents people below 15 years old. Each bar, horizontal bar, is 5-year group. So 0 to 4 years, 5 to 9 years, and 10 to 14 years. The one in yellow or orange is represent population age between 15 years and roughly 64. These are people who are supposed to be at work age, so who contribute, producing, and contribute to the economy. And the top one is the one people, the elderly, or seniors, age above 64 or 65. So what demography is that when you transit, you shift from that triangle to the one in the next one with a bigger middle. You have more people who are in population who can fully support themselves, support the one in the green section, and support those who are the elderly. That's what, in general, we call the youth bulge. The youth bulge means that you have more young people compared to any other group, and larger than the previous group. So until you transit there, you have a bulge. That means a stolen population in terms of numbers in this. So demographic dividend require the change in population structure, which will now boost economic growth and contribute. Of course, it's clear this is the potential. It's not that if you change your population overnight. In general, it's not overnight. With a few exceptions, the only case where you can do it overnight or over a very short period is if you have large either. So that's a critical issue that from a conceptual perspective, we need to discuss at country level and at global level, among academicians, researchers, but also among the second point, critical challenge we have is that you may have a person of working age, let's say 27, but who is not working. And I put there a few figures, not comprehensive, as to illustrate. You have country like where we sit now, in South Africa, where young people, age 24 to 35, about 28% of them are not working. So a change in the population structure with high unemployment rate may not lead to the development that we want. And it's not South Africa alone. Many countries. In fact, even worse, we don't even have the figure in some countries. So that's another critical issue we have. The third one is, as a challenge, that people be working, and I'm very sure that you have first-hand knowledge and experience of that. People are working, but not in decent work. The income, profit generated from that work cannot sustain life. And as we tried to implement the roadmap, these are some of the issues or the challenges. How to make sure that work sustain dignity and life. It's a critical issue. So how do we protect? What kind of measures do we need to? Quickly here, I have a map, yes, just to show in a very short time the situation of Africa and the vision related to the vision of Africa, Agenda 2063. We already know as a very large population, very good, right now, over 1 billion, 1.2 billion. We know that the population is very young. But at the same time, that's the positive side. But on the negative side, you see also that many women still die while giving birth. We know that unemployment is very high. And more importantly, we know that girls, young people are not, all of them are not educated, and particularly enrollment rate for girls in secondary and tertiary education is particularly low. And this is not the Africa we want as established in the Agenda 20. We also know that if young people are not educated, if they are not protected, and they are not employed, there's a risk not only to their life, but also to the community and the country they lived in. Next slide, yeah. This is an overview of where countries are right now in terms of the population structure. And what we call those who are at advanced stage of change in the population structure, and those who are still at the early stage, meaning that the age structure is still like the first pyramid we have, and they have not achieved, they are still transiting to the next. Next slide, please. So it has been presented earlier, based on these challenges and the vision the continent has to achieve the Agenda 2063, the roadmap of the African Union on demography, harnessing demography dividend, that's taking advantage of the youthful population, is that's taking advantage of the youthful population. The African Union then decided to develop a clear roadmap with the 4 pillars. The 4 pillars will look at the critical issues that we have already seen. 1, education, employment, health, and governance. And we'll go through them step by step. Health and well-being, which is one of the critical areas. You see, for this is where we have one of the biggest challenge. How do we make sure that we have a healthy population, particularly among youth? How do we make sure that young people, particularly young girls, are not dying? So critical action to be implemented are written and mentioned in the roadmap. But the roadmap cannot achieve if it's not well understood and if it's not taken care of by all. It can just be, and the president of the youth parliamentarian, Pan-African youth clearly said that moving from discourse to practical and in fact to action, although discourse could also be action. Yeah. Second, from health, we move to education and skill development. And for me personally, I think this is a very critical component. Without education, it will be difficult to even induce the population age, a change in the population age structure. Because if people are not educated and empowered, then they will still face the similar challenge that our grandparents faced. But if they are educated, then they have more knowledge and they can innovate even in the way they address those issues. And for young people, it's particularly important. We know in Africa, we have done well in terms of access to primary education during the previous framework, but we are still struggling with secondary and tertiary education. Of course, very often when you say that, and you are probably in your community constituencies, but also sometimes with some member of the executive, that, oh no, if you educate, then young people will be, they'll be more demanding and then start causing problems. You hear that in some of the rhetoric or discourse. I don't agree with that. Of course, it's not my opinion that counts. But I think the fact educating people is empowering them. Even if we know that currently across the world, the number of people graduating from school is higher than what the current labor market can absorb, that's not an excuse to reduce investment in education. That's not an excuse to start changing or redirecting investment related to education. It's rather give us an opportunity to review how to educate, to review the system and make the education system and curriculum more adapted to the changing environment. And my prayer here is for us to really strengthen our commitment to education, and particularly education of young people and young girls. I say particular because I also believe it's very important for demographic dividend. Education and learning is not only for young people, it's also what we call lifelong learning for the adult and the elderly. How do they manage the elderly? How do they manage the post-production lifestyle is important. The third one is employment and entrepreneurship. This is where we have a major challenge. As I say, education system as it is now, probably not adapted to a labor market, but can be. So how do we make the connection? I think that's where collaboration between the different, particularly with young people, so that they can contribute to the thinking of how do we change the economy? How do we make the current context pro-entrepreneurship, conducive for business? How do we make that and bring on board young people? So that's what the challenge is. The fourth pillar is right governance and empowerment. These pillars were developed, of course, taking cognizance of the challenges that the continent is facing, but also it's open opportunity on how do we change those challenges into opportunities. And one under that is was strengthening governance and the rule of law. I will not say much on that because that's in your area. But I think what is critical here, and we have challenge as well as opportunity, is governance, monitoring, accountability goes with evidence, with data. If we don't have data on the population, data on the functioning of the system, it will be difficult to really promote right, and governance. In the context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the catchphrase that is related to rights, which says, leave no one beyond, that everyone counts, leave no one beyond. And what we say related to that is, how do you know if anyone is beyond, if in the first case you don't even know where they are? If you don't know where a particular person is, how do you know if they are beyond? In other words, if we don't have updated, disaggregated information on the population we serve, or the population we are part of, how can we promote governance and rules of law? How can we do this if, for example, in countries, children who are born are not registered in the civil registration system? How can we promote governance and rule of law if people do not exist legally in the system through civil registration, or do not exist because there have been no population and census, housing census to know the characteristics where people are living? So it's called for a critical change in the way we look at evidence generation, in the way we look at data information on the population, and particularly those who are the most vulnerable. I'm a demographer by training myself. And the challenge very often is that those who are missing in data are exactly the most vulnerable and the poor. The one we want, but not one. The government and population want to uplift. So this is a critical challenge that we need to address. Address the issue of data, disaggregated data, visible, the most vulnerable, and the poor, so that their needs and work with them to promote inclusive development. Next slide, please. So what we say that for demographic dividend to happen, first you need a change in the population structure. That's what we call the demographic transition. But education can lead to this. Education and empowerment of the population, and particularly the girl child, can lead to the demographic transition. At the same time, the demographic transition will amplify what we call the impact of good or bad policies. And I would like us to quickly look at the two diagrams that we have there, and it's focused on the four pillars of the African Union. What we are saying that if we don't act and use the transition, we have other very, the blue one, problematic situation, including the issue that the chair mentioned, unrest and fragility, because of a healthy population, because of education system or non-skilled labor force that cannot really deliver, or because of many other issues. But if we invest and work on the four pillars, then the impact will be amplified. You may have a healthy and educated population, which is already a bonus. May have that population engage in and I stress decent employment, and contribute, of course, to promoting governance and the rule of law. Right. That was at the macro level. And Honorable, I would like you and all of us to think about how do we explain to the individual, to our neighbor, to a person, the concept of demographic dividend, or even before that, the concept of economic growth. I don't know how in our daily life we explain that to the population. What we are proposing is to use the individual life cost. And we think it's better or easily understood, moving from the macro level, the economic growth deriving from the change in the population structure, to the micro level, individual level. This is the path of an individual. Let's say an adolescent girl. We have two options. Either we act and address the challenges that we have, and we have the green line, which goes to harness demographic dividend. That is to secure, first, that the child is born healthy, so working with the mother, the parent, and all this. Second, make sure that that child goes to school. If it's an adolescent girl, make sure that she's not compelled, engaged in forced marriage early enough before she's mature. So support her, empower her. She gets a good education, employed, get married at she's adult, has the number of children she and her partner, her husband, want, meaning that they have access to services to help them to achieve the number of children they want to achieve, and then contribute to the economy. That's what demographic dividend will be. This person will contribute more than what they have been consuming, contribute to the family, and age graciously, everything being equal elsewhere, and still continue to contribute to the development. Or we have another path, which is the status quo. It's what we have now. No education, almost abandoned. The girl child is forced into marriage, or not, if not in marriage, having early pregnancy, drop out, give birth as a child, and we know one of the consequences of that is what? Obstetric fistula, and then contribution to the labor market will be limited, and so forth, and go on, and we will miss the demographic dividend. So what I'm saying here is, in terms of challenges, we know some of the challenges. It's protecting the transition of the girl child, of the young person, from childhood to healthy aging, through empowerment in education, health services, what else am I missing? Yeah, labor force, 4 pillars that were mentioned. Or we miss it. And what is critical is that we have opportunities to address all these challenges. The legal framework that was presented, Africa is one of the most beautiful legal framework in terms of some of these issues. The Youth Charter that was mentioned is one. The Maputo Plan of Action is one. The African Human Rights is, the legal framework, but how do we move from the framework to make sure that the individual benefits from it? I'll try to end here because by presenting what countries are doing and what I've done. And I think there's a very good progress that has been made. Here, I try to color the map based on the information that we received so far. On the launch of the theme of the year, harnessing demographic dividend in Africa. In green, these are countries that have launched the theme of the year. I don't know if it's in collaboration with the parliament in your country, but at least in a number of countries, this has been done. In yellow and orange, these are countries that have done what's called a study, the demographic dividend study. There are more countries, some in green, have done the study and launched it. Zambia did a very good demography dividend study. Uganda was among the first to do that, which is informing actually in Zambia, the study supported by us, UNEP, has informed the 7 National Development Plan. Data is used to really guide in this. We have a number of countries that have not yet, and I think going forward, the critical issue is to make sure that this commitment through the launch is sustained, and that the launch is translated, the launch of the demography, the theme of the year, is translated into critical assessment of the situation, what we call the diagnosis. And third, use that to inform policies and programs. If we don't do that, we will miss the demographic dividend. So, Chair, in conclusion, the challenges that we have are conceptual, they are programmatic. At the same time, you may up the previous one. Yes. Okay, that's the last slide that I want to leave you with that. So the challenges we have, I'd say, were conceptual, understanding what demographic dividend is at macro level and at micro level. Second is at programmatic level. So what is needed to harness the demographic dividend, and the roadmap give a clear direction. Third is that the opportunities are many, and young people, particularly, at least those I interacted with, and just last week we were doing some work with the African Union with young people, are willing to contribute to this process, are willing to be engaged and help really the continent to keep the demographic dividend. Demographic dividend, in short, is actually a translation of intergenerational relationship, and both between the older generation to the younger one, but also between the younger one and the older generation. Because there are 2 types of demographic dividend. The first one with a youthful population, the second one with a healthy aging, when the elderly can benefit from this. On this, I say thank you and open.
Thank you very much, and the presentation is so much that we did not want you to stop again, except that we ourselves want to start to contribute. You have spoken a lot in relation to the subject matter. What really reminds me of, in our simple or primary or secondary economic studies, we talked about factors of production. And we say land is one of those factors of production. It is abundant in Africa. Land is everywhere. And we say capital. Then we start to experience challenges. What kind of capital do we want? Where can we source this capital? So there is a question mark in it. I will say labor. We look at the youth market. It's in abundant supply. And we look at the other critical factor, which has to do with entrepreneurship. How do we get to know what we want to do? Entrepreneurship. How could we be able to combine these various factors of production for us to be able to get onto where we want to? We look at the critical of our society, customs and tradition. In some other societies, a girl at the age of 9 is to get married and start to bring dividend in the home. You start to contribute in the home. Big challenge. How do we cope with that kind of challenge? customs is as soon as you finish your schooling. In fact, you should not continue schooling after primary school. You should start to contribute now to the welfare of the home. You see, we have all of these problems put in together. And when you come to the issue of our various parliaments, our legislatures, and you look at the agreements, the protocols that we sign, how do they feed into our legal framework in our country? For example, you have this vision, 2023, vision 2030, vision this. How do you bring a synergy between this vision, international obligations, and your budget at home? You present your budget in December. For example, in Sierra Leone, we present our budget in December. And you ratify this protocol or this agreement, and you want to feed that in to your budget, you run into a problem. And what do? The next thing you do is you start looking at your central bank to finance your programs. And as soon as you do that, you run into problems with your donor partners, with the IMF. They start telling you that your Banking Act only calls for 5% of previous year's revenue. So you cannot borrow from the central bank in excess of what you have already got. By then, you would have already spent 3 years out of the 5 years that you've been voted for. You only now have 1 year, because the other year is for you to campaign. And you start to struggle. And you start enlisting the youths to support your political programs. You see, so you have all of these intertwining, putting together. How do we bring a synergy so that we can adequately address these issues for us to start getting dividend out of our various studies? How do you address the issue of conflicts within our societies? You want to start talking about peace in your society. You say peace is the absence of war. When the guns are silent, you say that's peace. But how do you convert the excess energy of these youths into some productive? The issue of literacy, relevant educational programs. All of these are pointers to the that we face in our development agenda. But we have gathered here this 1 or 2 days to look at these experiences and to share our experiences to see what roadmap that we can take, so that when we get back home, we will be able to bring out suggestions to our various parliaments. Recently, I was a guest in the Parliament of Ghana and the Parliament of Uganda to undertake a study on the budget process and to see how we can establish a budget office. We have finished with the report. We have laid the report. The challenge now is to see whether we would have the support from our parliament. But luckily, at the CPA, the last CPA meeting in Abuja, these are the 2 things that came up, that they want to encourage all parliaments to become e-parliament and to establish, budget offices. so that this reliance on the executive will be addressed. These are all experiences that we may like to share so that we can enrich the advice that we give to our various speakers. So maybe a few comments on the presentations. We may now open up the floor for contributions and questions. Our consultants are still around so that they can further fill in. Oh, there is a fourth presentation. So much consumed by the last presentation that I almost forgot that we still have one more presentation. You see, it was placed at the back. I am sorry. No. My colleague. I'll listen to the last presentation and to see what he also has in stock for us. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President of our association, ladies and gentlemen, members of a committee of ASGAP, chairperson of the Pan-African Youth Union, Secretary General, Clerks, who have invited Parliament's honorable delegates, all protocols observed. It is dangerous to take the floor after the person. After the appropriate person has already talked about the youth. And as far as I am concerned, and from the perspective of the Pan-African Parliament, I wanted to wish all of you welcome. First of all, wish you all a very warm welcome. It is an exceptional opportunity for me to see the youth. It is good for the youth that all of you eminent persons have met here to talk about the future of our continent, the of our youth. I would like to wish you a very warm welcome in this place that is full of meaning and symbols. After a lot of good intentions and after all the time of talking and after the time of acting, we meet today to think about the role of parliamentarians in the intention to harness the demographic dividend through investment in the youth. Now, allow me to mention here that our parliament is, our continent rather, is characterized by its youth. It is of great value, and it is that is very useful, and Africa cannot meet all the challenges unless the youth are involved in the use of Africa's resources and are also involved in all socio-economic aspects of life. Today, the lack of involvement of the youth is a fact, and we are paying dearly for it. And that is why our heads of state during their summit thought that they should begin looking at the of involving the youth, and it is for that reason that they decided that for 2017 they would adopt the theme harnessing the demographic dividends through investment in the youth. Through this theme that is very relevant. The vision of our heads of state and government is supposed to make the youth qualified using all the material and financial resources that they need to use in order to make it possible for the youth to contribute to the development of the continent. I remind us in passing that the Pan-African Parliament set up an organ entitled the Youth Caucus, and through a motion on the 15th of October 2012, and by resolution number Papa stroke E3 stroke ORES of 18th October 2012 in order to fulfill the following objectives: strengthen and consolidate the efforts that are aimed at giving African youth greater responsibility through their effective participation, meaningful and equal partnership in the management of the programs aimed at developing the continent, work with the civil society and other stakeholders within member states in order to facilitate the ratification and the implementation of the African Youth Charter, ensure the link with the Pan-African Committee on youth activities in collaboration with the parliaments in member states, and implement the program of youth development in keeping with the African Youth Charter, coordinate and cooperate with the committees that deal with the issue of youth within the Pan-African Parliament. You can see the empowerment of young people in the areas of education, in the area of employment on the African continent. And as head of, as the Secretary General, different parliaments, I would like that you become the representatives and spokespersons for the youth to parliamentarians, and that you may ensure that the issue of youth becomes a major item on the agendas of your respective parliaments. We without being without pride, continue to think that we can remove all those obstacles that keep some of our states from ratifying and implementing African Union treaties, and also we should together think on new strategies that would make it possible for our youth within the Pan-African Parliament to work for the implementation of treaties and other instruments within the African Union. And as far as the empowerment of the youth is, and especially as far as the empowerment of the youth is concerned, as young parliamentarians, the time or never for us to make history by proposing future perspectives that carry promise. It is for us to identify the resources to make it possible for the youth of this continent to take responsibility for themselves and to ensure their future as well. And then finally, the roadmap of the African on the implementation of the youth of 2017 that was agreed on in Kigali in 2016 really specifies major areas of investments which are identified as in which African states must invest in the youth so as to optimize their demographic dividend. We're talking about employment, we're talking about business, entrepreneurship, education, we're talking about capacity building, we're talking about health, we're talking about well-being, we're talking about the rights of the empowerment of the youth in good governance policies. Each one of these pillars has the clear action points and areas of investment, and as well as the strategic areas so that African states be put on the road to harvest demographic dividend of the youth and the implementation of Agenda 2063, which is sustainable development. Taking into account that the integration of Agenda 2063 is the theme for 2017 in terms of at the level of our legislative assemblies. It means that we need to be sensitized both at the national and at the regional levels. To conclude, I would like, in conclusion, I would like to say that all the young people of this continent have their eyes fixed on us. For time to work with them, we do not need to disappoint them. Chairperson, I don't want to speak too much because the other speakers have already said everything that to say about the youth, and I just tried to summarize what I had wanted to say as far as the youth is concerned, and as far as the Pan-African Parliament is concerned, at least from the legislative perspective. We have a caucus which is called the Youth Caucus, which has been in place since 2012, and which has a responsibility of all issues that has to do with the youth. I will have proposals to make tomorrow in the Assembly of Speakers of National Parliaments, and I'd like to wish you all good and fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Very much for that brief but well-loaded presentation. We have had all the presentations, and we are about to go now for lunch. That will assist us to assimilate a lot of what we have been able to gather around, so that by the time we come back, we would have been able to charge ourselves to vigorously look at the various concepts that have been presented to us and be able to share our experiences. See, all the presentations that were made this afternoon, starting from the morning, they all bear relationships to one another. And the challenge now is, what can we do as parliaments to put into these presentations that have been made? Starting, first of all, to convince our various speakers who will assemble here, starting tomorrow, so that when they go back home and present their report to the House, we would have been able to do justice to the meeting which has been scheduled for us. So without saying much, and not allowing the lunch to get cold, it is my pleasure on your behalf to thank the presenters. And I'm sure that they will still be around discussions, so that if there are any areas that need strengthening or further explanation, they will be able to be around to do justice to any questions that will come up. So once again, I thank you very much, my colleagues, and I wish ourselves continued celebration with the women. So, but I don't know where you'll be taking us, we the men, this evening. Or if you do not have any program, perhaps the men have program for you. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to the afternoon session. Thank you. Some announcement.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Lunch is going to be served in the restaurant. Most of you know where the restaurant is. You just go straight from the chamber, straight, and then on the left-hand side. And after lunch, our session will restart at 2:30. Yes. Oh, sorry. Maybe at a 2:45. Just to a quarter.
15 heures. 15 heures, il faut dire.